Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Bobby Gee. Bobby's compositions, described by the Financial Times as expressive and gripping, and by CityNews CBR as exciting, frenzied, and unpredictable, explore themes of communication, hybridity, and home. A winner of the Barlow Prize, he's also received fellowships from the Mata Festival, the Bang on a Can Summer Festival, the Minnesota Orchestra Composer Institute, and Copeland House. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Bobby, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you. Can you please tell us about yourself and what are you working on now?
Yeah, hey, thanks so much for having me. It's always fun to do these kinds of artist-to-artist chats, just about our respective crafts and worlds. So I'm mostly a composer. I mostly work with composed notation and all of that kind of thing. I grew up playing piano. A lot of the music that I write engages in some way, shape, or form with what you might call the classical tradition. The last couple of projects that I just took on were these two orchestral commissions. And so those pieces were incredibly stressful to complete, actually, because for some reason the deadline was the same day, coincidentally, for these two pieces. It was a little bit brutal, but we got through, we're okay. And so both of these pieces were kind of inspired by kind of literary subject matter. And now I'm sort of taking a break until the next couple of projects.
Literary sources. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in and drawn to these kinds of interdisciplinary, like cross-disciplinary interactions, if that makes sense. Many of my pieces are created either somewhat collaboratively or else they usually draw on some kind of extra musical subject matter, so to speak. For whatever reason, I've always found that to be really inspiring for myself. So one of the pieces is this piece called Through the Air and Underground. A lot of composers have been interested in this novelist named Richard Powers, fairly well-known figure, but he had that book that for some reason everyone seemed to read, The Overstory. And so I remember being really taken by the beauty and structure of that novel, which I think is why it's appealing to composers. I know actually at this point, a couple of composers who've independently written pieces inspired by that particular work. I mean, my take is that it has such a beautiful lyrical kind of flow to its prose, and also structurally it has this kind of large-scale architecture that composers often are drawn to. So that was like a big point of inspiration for that particular piece. And
Is that title drawn from the novel? Where does the title come from?
yeah, so Through the Air and Underground. So this piece was commissioned by the Reno Chamber Orchestra. They have this program called Sound Investment Commission, where basically they pick like a composer to sort of work with, and over the year they bring them out, just to like visit Reno and get to know the town, the people, the folks who are investing in the piece. And so a lot of the time, the expectation, I don't know if it's necessarily an expectation, but it's sort of what usually happens is the composers will sort of draw upon natural landscape of Reno, fascinating region and place, and have that sort of somehow work into the piece itself. And so I guess Reno's has, I really hadn't thought anything. I've never been to the area, like the high desert, I think they call it, and knew basically nothing about that whole biome. And so what was interesting to me was getting to know like how plants and trees and flora and fauna manage to survive in a place that can seemingly be so inhospitable. And so two of the main methods that these trees and plants proliferate is, through the air and underground, which incidentally is a phrase, yes, that is directly drawn from Richard Powers' Overstory. Yeah.
You grew up in China. Are you bilingual or you mainly think and work in English?
So that's a great question. I think I used to be fully bilingual, and I think as time has gone on, my Chinese has sort of just gradually declined. So now my main time that I speak Chinese is when I call my mom or visit my mom, visit my parents, that kind of thing. And even my mom speaks fantastic English. So, basically the way that it's worked out now is we kind of, I'm sure this is true for so many people who are multilingual, we sort of switch back and forth mid-sentence a lot of the time because there might be certain phrases or ideas or certain imagery that's just easier to convey in one language instead of another. But yeah, at this point in time, I find Chinese, it works, it can get around, but it's definitely not anything I would feel comfortable delivering like a speech in or something. Growing up in Shanghai, I went to this like international school, right? There were people from Korea, from Japan, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then, Chinese mainland, as well as people from abroad. So like people from India, people from the US, Canada, so on and so forth. There was like too many people, so many accents all the time, so many different languages. And so we developed this kind of quasi pidgin language of sorts, right? There were so many loan words constantly from all these different languages combining together. We would oftentimes like curse in Korean, for example, because the teachers were teaching us English or teaching us Chinese. And so they didn't know what Korean was. And so we would swear in class in Korean sometimes. Or we would do things like turn Japanese phrases that our friends would say backwards or something. We had these crazy combinations of languages that would arise and all of that. I guess suffice it to say that that's sort of how I've engaged with and I think about language and people. I feel like at the end of the day, it's like for me, on a very practical level, it's like as long as we're able to roughly communicate what we're trying to say, I feel like then we're in good shape, even if the precision of it isn't necessarily totally intact. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yes, and that's why when
Yeah.
before we even started recording and we asked you, how do you pronounce your last name? And
Right.
and I'm
Yeah.
like, how do you pronounce your name? And I said, well, however you feel like. And for some people who have never been in those circumstances, mixed with other people, they don't understand. We both, my husband and I, we have friends from all over the world. And I came here as a Fulbright scholar and he met a bunch of Fulbright scholars. And like we all speak different English and have different pronunciation for words or names. And at least for me, it's a lot of fun,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've heard so many variations and variants on it from like je to gay to gi, so on and so forth.
I don't really care how people pronounce my name. That's the last
Mm,
thing for me to think about
mm.
because there are better things to spend my thinking time on. And it's actually funny. So in a lot of languages, female names end with A. And we're married, so my name ends with O and his ends with A. And one time we
Oh,
went to an event and you can take it in
I
a
don't think this is the only time, but yeah, one time we were speakers at an event and they transposed our names in our pictures.
right.
So he
Yeah.
put him Ito and I am Makaya. And
All right.
And like,
I see. Yeah.
and I like, she always gets the emails to Mr. Otini, and I always get the emails to Mrs. Otini.
Yeah, and again, it's like from a Western perspective, that actually might make a ton of sense, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny.
Well,
yes,
it's
Wow.
like even
Yeah.
funnier too, because I feel like, we don't really follow prescribed gender roles, but to the extent that we do, I feel like I follow the female prescribed roles more. Like
Sure.
I
Sure.
like the
Yeah.
kitchen. I kind of like
Oh, me too. Oh, yeah.
like
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and Ito has like a more forceful personality. Mine is like a gentle go with the flow. So like it kind
Yeah.
of works.
Oh, totally. No, man, oh my goodness, so much to talk about here. My partner says a lot of the same things about me where it's like, I too love the kitchen. I love to cook. I actually like have developed this weird, almost pathological love of doing the dishes, which is, I realize is like kind of insane. Like most people like hate that task. It's like, I will actively,
Very relatable.
yeah, it's like, I will actively do the dishes by hand, even if we have a functioning dishwasher in the home. You know
So
what I mean? And-
yeah, this one too.
Yeah, okay, so I got myself in trouble because I
Mm.
was invited to a neighbor's Shabbat party one time, and I just, I didn't know anyone there. So, when I don't know anyone at a party, my go-to
Oh,
response is to
to
order
be useful.
dishes. And
Right.
it was Shabbat, so I
Totally.
got reprimanded for doing that. I'm like, "But there's no dog, and your
Right.
dishes are off limits. What am I supposed to do here? Like,
Right.
nobody knows me, and I don't know anyone." So, yeah, there are times and places for that, and that's not one of them.
Right.
So
No, totally. I mean, sometimes that makes you wonder about like, I don't know. I have some kind of kooky theory about the differences between gender norms and all that kind of thing across different countries. I remember growing up, at least for me in China, I feel like the whole like quiet, studious vibe was touted as this like I don't even know if it's like a masculine ideal necessarily, but I feel like no one ever told me I shouldn't be doing that, and everyone seemed to encourage me to do that. And so, this whole like bookish, kind of quiet, nerdy, doing my own thing, and then kind of, developing interests in things like art and music. Like I remember one time when I got to the States, I was shocked by how many people clocked me consistently as gay, which I'm not, but apparently it's like so many of my mannerisms and behaviors that I guess I just developed for whatever reason growing up in China, which I was never ever insecure about, right? It was just things I like to do, is who I am, how I move, how I walk, how I talk, etc. And I guess for some reason in the States it was perceived differently, which is kind of fascinating.
That's funny. They did
yeah.
perceive me as a lesbian, and I
Really?
didn't know.
Really?
I think a year or 2 years later, I found that people concluded that they didn't even bother to ask me. Like, they're
Right.
like, just, yeah, she's lesbian. And I was like, wow. I mean, that would be a really cool essay to write about, like,
Yeah.
first North African writer lesbian. But I was like, well, but I really am not.
Right. Yeah.
In the same respect that Bill Clinton was our first black president.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I've also been consistently read as gay and also consistently as Jewish.
Really? Yeah.
And I
Really?
stopped,
Oh,
I
interesting.
stopped
Yeah.
being read as gay when I got married, as far as I know. But
Right.
but I'm still consistently read as Jewish.
Fascinating. Yeah. One last story about this. So my partner and I, we were traveling in China, so back in Shanghai, right? It was the first time I was back in like 6 years or something. It's great. It was wonderful. It was great to eat the food, great to walk the streets, and good public transit, all that stuff. And I remember there was a person, like a middle-aged businessman, just walking around, just minding his own business in Shanghai, and he was holding an umbrella because it was like a little bit of a drizzle, and it was a bright pink yellow kitty parasol. And I remember we both saw that, and I didn't even think twice about it because there was something about Shanghai 2000s and 2010s. These things weren't necessarily fashion accessories. It was just very functional, like the kind of umbrella that's the cheapest, is most widely accessible, is going to be parasol or something like that being sold in usually some kind of fake market situation, right? And so it's like, yeah, it's just a very typical sight for me. But then my partner, Ellie, she was like fascinated. She just like kept staring and trying to figure out, like, is this a statement? Does this mean something? Because I feel like if it were in the States, it would be a very different connotation, right? If you had someone who is dressed otherwise in a fairly masculine business sort of situation and they have like a bright pink umbrella parasol or something, it just would be read very differently. Just something that I think about. Differences in norms, culture, so on and so forth, and how different connotations can settle around objects and iconography and all. I don't know. Just, yeah.
So do you feel that code switching in language and culture, do you feel that it affects your compositional style? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think it might almost be easier to say how it doesn't affect my music. It was a long time when I first began to compose. I had this sort of weird question. Maybe you can call it guilt. I don't know. It was a question where I wondered, like, am I obligated to write something that sounds very Chinese, so to speak? Am I supposed to write, as someone who grew up in China and everything, am I supposed to try to write music that sounds very pentatonic and has this kind of traditional folksy sound and whatnot? And I was really hung up on that for a while for whatever reason. The way it resolved eventually is I don't write music that sounds that way. And I think eventually I actually became self-conscious of writing music that people might expect a Chinese person to write, if that makes sense. Like, the truth is that I didn't grow up playing folk instruments. I didn't grow up playing or engaging with the Chinese folk tradition. The music that I spent all my time listening to growing up was like film music or classical music for whatever reason. And so gradually I sort of shed those insecurities, I guess, about what music was quote unquote supposed to sound like. But a lot of it had to do with this idea of perception. Like, if I'm perceived as a Chinese person, would people expect me to write a certain kind of music, a more Chinese sounding kind of music? And eventually I just sort of decided, no, I don't. It just didn't feel true to me, I suppose.
Have you ever considered, either for the sake of marketing or just for the sake of a social experiment, taking a piece of music that you wrote and you wrote it the way you wanted to write it and then titling it in Chinese characters or promoting it as if it is, very Chinese, and like just seeing if people notice that it's not? Have you ever thought of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've never tried that. I mean, I've definitely written pieces where I've involved like Chinese characters or something, but I guess never for the sake of experiment that way.
Because people will project onto, all art is a mirror, really. So
Right,
there's
totally,
that.
yeah.
I forget the source of the quote, but nobody ever reads a book that they don't already have inside them. Every time we engage with art, we're always engaging with our own expectations reflected back to us, but it can be kind of amusing when you can toy with the audience's expectations.
Oh, totally.
I mean, not just art. When I was in Morocco, I was so obsessed with American culture, but I didn't have access to, Hollywood or television or even the internet. I was just
Right.
obsessed with the idea of American culture. And I went to the American Language Center. That's where I learned English. So I wanted my Moroccan friends to feel like I am American. I know a lot.
Mm.
And I would make some really stupid foods and call them American foods. And man, my Moroccan friends thought they were so yummy. And I would just, put turkey with eggs, which I never did.
Turkey is kind of an American food, though.
Well, put it with weird sauces.
I could see it, though. I think Thanksgiving of some kind. I don't know. Maybe even breakfast meal. I don't know.
And I did that too when I came to the US. I would make really weird food that I just made up and tell my American friends, that's very wrong.
It was a classic Moroccan cuisine. I love it. That's great.
Since we're talking about lineage, what lineage would you situate your music in?
That's a great question. I feel like a lot of my peers, and I don't mean this in any denigrating way at all, it's just many of them, it's this whole fight the canon, destroy the repertoire we have. We're making music for us for the moment, for a totally different world, totally different sets of needs, which I totally resonate with. At the same time, I genuinely love listening to a Beethoven symphony or a Brahms concerto or a Tchaikovsky concerto or something like that. If there's a composer who I really, really identify with, it might be Sibelius. He's this Finnish composer, mid-20th century. People lump him in with this kind of nationalistic composer type where he was sort of instrumental in forming a Finnish musical identity. It's not so much the nationalistic elements I connect with as so much as just his musical style. I really love his sense of drama, his sense of rigor, where basically his whole thing is how much musical mileage can I get out of a very small number of notes? I have a 3-note idea. How could you stretch that, compress that, contort it into all kinds of different variations and eventually write a 30-minute piece out of a 3-note motif or something like that? And so that stuff is really exciting to me. For my own music, I'm attracted to a certain unity, I guess, of ideas, taking something small and transforming it or stretching it. And then, of course, I'm also still interested in drama without necessarily leaning into sort of conventional romantic light and dark kind of narrative.
So I guess to invert that question, where do you feel you depart consciously from the tradition that you're part of?
One of the most obvious points to me, I think, is just I don't see myself strictly as an orchestral composer or even a strictly acoustic instrumental composer. One recent development is I've become really excited about live visual elements and all of that as well in my music. And so what that ends up looking like is a musician basically triggering live visuals and live images, film, that kind of thing. That they're able to maintain this kind of spontaneity of a live performance that still is very much in communication with the fellow musicians around them instead of being, stuck to some kind of click track. I've done a couple of pieces that are sort of inspired by corny meditation videos, where you'll have text that appears on screen, breathe in, remember, so on and so forth, and you can easily contort that in very silly and very dynamic ways. I've done 2 or 3 pieces now where these kinds of live visuals are directly integrated into, I guess, a chamber or an orchestral setting. And to my mind, I think they've gone off pretty well. It's been really fun. Beyond just the technical stuff, I think an easy point to start with is just I'm always interested in trying to create music that either evokes a specific kind of imagery or is directly in dialogue with a particular kind of imagery. I'm really interested in communication, whether it's between myself and a fellow artist in a different medium, or I guess even communication between musicians in a very specific or prescribed way. I particularly enjoy playing with different kinds of notation that make musicians cue each other and force them to think about how they're relating to each other. Yeah, and so that's a parameter that I'm also interested in.
That's cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed having you.
Yeah, likewise. This is so much fun.
Yeah, same here.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Bye.